So now to start the program, I'm going to transition over to our guest speaker. I think Bill might be in the back of the room. And again, I just want to thank Bill for taking the time to be here with us and to share his story. It's a journey of inspiration, I think the strength of family, and it really, really underscores the importance of what we do with Narcan. So Bill, again, thank you so much for being here with us. I'd ask everyone to please join me in welcoming Bill Kinkle to the stage. Thank you so much.
Yep. Clicker. Good. Thanks. Appreciate it. All right. Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a real treat and a real privilege to be out in Scottsdale. It's one of my favorite corners of the country to be in, and I hope that I can encourage you and maybe push you a little bit to keep doing what you're doing a little bit more to help people like me and the people that I care about the most. So obviously, from the credentials on the screen, you can see that I have quite the background in opioid use disorder and naloxone administration, but I'm also a person in sustained recovery from an opioid use disorder myself. And I spend just a lot of my time thinking about that and advocating and trying to speak about this issue to try to save lives. Because for me, the bottom line is there's a lot of people that I deeply care about, and I don't want them to die. And so my story kind of starts. I entered healthcare at a very young age. I was a nurse's aide at 17, an EMT at 18, and a paramedic at 19. And I became a paramedic in the early 1990s. And as you can see from the photos, I was very, very young. And I don't think I was quite mature at that age to really comprehend and appreciate what I was going to be doing on a daily basis. And in that time period, I worked in a firehouse, which was a very testosterone-rich, heavy environment. We didn't talk about mindfulness, and we didn't debrief from calls. It just wasn't something that we did. If I went out on a call and resuscitated a 6-year-old and came back to the firehouse and wanted to talk about and process how that affected me as a 19-year-old boy, really, that probably would have ensured that I wouldn't have my job very long, because the job required that you get up and you go to the next call and you go to the next call and go to the next call. And so that was my life at a very young age, but I wanted to do more. So I went to school, I became a nurse, and I worked in the emergency department at the University of Pennsylvania for about 11 years as an ER nurse. And there I was involved in just very typical of me and very typical of what I do now, is that I wanted to do more, and I wanted to have an impact on the world. I wanted my work to mean something, so that when I was dead, I wanted what I did to have meant something, and I wanted the world to be a better place when I left it, as I do now. And so I was involved in a lot of heavy academic work, doing a lot of research, doing a lot of speaking. I traveled the world on the international circuit, doing airway management type things, intubation. And some of the papers that I worked on, I mean, if you were to go to the operating room right now for a procedure and went under general anesthesia, the procedure would be done different, and it would be safer for you because of the work that I was a part of back then. And so I was heavy involved in pushing the field and advancing the field early on. And I don't say this as hey, look at me, how wonderful I was. I'm kind of setting the stage for how did someone like me develop an opioid use disorder. And so for me, it was around the year 2000 or so that I was visited by this guy here. And I don't mean FDR. That's probably a conversation for another time. But the thing in the top corner is a kidney stone. And so I experienced a kidney stone. I was prescribed oxycodone. And I remember when I took oxycodone, all was kind of right with the world for me. And not so much, the euphoria, it was a nice buzz. And it felt good. But there was something different, something deeper with opioids for me. That I felt very comfortable in my own skin, so to speak. I felt that I was really comfortable in social environments. I felt very much at one with fellow humanity in a strange way. And so what I decided to do is I didn't take my prescription as prescribed. I didn't take it for the pain. I dealt with the pain, and I kept the prescription on the side. And what I did is I would use the opioids for like a camping trip or a concert or something more social so that I would feel more connected and more at ease and I didn't have so much anxiety around other folks. But when the prescription was gone, it was gone. And that really didn't, nothing really came out of it from then. But it was about 8 years later or so, around 2008, that I abruptly experienced divorce. And I became depressed. And again, thinking back to where I came as a young paramedic, up until that point, I thought mental illness was nonsense. I didn't believe that there was such a thing as depression. Everything was about just pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But I knew that I wasn't right, and I wasn't functioning at the level that I was used to functioning at work. And so I went home one night. I was working in the intensive care unit. I went home with some Dilaudid, and I was in the basement of my house, and I thought, so I took it home by accident. Back then, you kind of dosed people, and you stick it in your pocket. It was a really very busy environment. And so I didn't purposefully take it home. It just kind of ended up in my pocket, and I forgot to put it back in the box and waste it and went home with it. But I thought, hey, let me try that and see what happens. And that cured my depression. It fixed everything. And so that became more of a habitual thing. And within about a month, as my depression progressed and I got sicker and sicker, I figured out how to buy street heroin. And how that happened, I was sitting in the biomed research library at Penn, and I was looking at chemical diagrams of opioids and realized that heroin is very similar. And I thought, let me see if that does anything. And so I found street heroin, and I started using that. And so you would think that the decision to make that, like, how does that happen? And for me, at that point that I sought street heroin, my depression was so severe that I was routinely contemplating suicide. And so the decision to use heroin, for me, it was either I'm going to put a gun in my mouth and pull the trigger, or I'm going to use this and accept the negative consequences that come with that, because I don't really know how to survive otherwise. And so it was only about 8 months or so after I started using street heroin that I ended up here. And this is a neighborhood in Philly, Kensington, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, but this is where I grew up as a kid, and this is the street that I grew up in as a kid. In that first abandoned lot between those houses, that's where the house was that I was staying at the time, because I found myself homeless. I had lost my career, everything depleted, and I was living in an abandoned house. And this isn't an exact photo of the room, but it looked pretty close to that, but that is the street. And so I found myself homeless on the streets in Kensington. So 8 months prior, I was speaking around the world. I just published a book, doing all this great practice-changing work. Now I find myself homeless in Kensington, and my day revolves around, how can I not be in withdrawal? How can I not be sick? How can I get the next shot of heroin? And so the big question that's plagued me over the past 10 years is, well, how did it happen? And then why did that happen? What was it at the age of 34 that I thought that it might be a good idea to start using opioids and using heroin? And then the question that I spend the majority of my life now trying to deconstruct and make sense of is, did everything need to happen the way it did? Did I need to experience homelessness? Did I need to go to jail? Did I need to experience being raped in jail? Did I need to overdose more times than I can count so that I exquisitely know what it feels like to receive Narcan? And I think the answer is no. But now my work is, how do we start moving past that? And so trying to piece this together, I started looking at a lot of research and reading and a lot of introspective work to figure out, what is it that predisposed me? Why is it that when my wife takes an opioid, she spits it out because she hates it and hates the feeling, but I want to pull it out of the trash can and gobble it up? What's different about us that makes it that way for me? And so a big part of it, like I talked about earlier, being a paramedic at a very young age and dealing with life and death at a very young age, for me, there's something about me that I relate to other humans very, very deeply. I didn't take my work as a nurse and as a paramedic, and right now as a harm reduction advocate, it's not a job for me. I see them as people, and I take it to heart when they don't make it. And so over the years, I think there was 15 years of my life, my daily life in the ER was 15-year-old kid comes in with multiple gunshot wounds, and I'm part of the resuscitation team, and we're doing CPR, and we're doing all these procedures, and I'm working with the team around me and using every bit of technical expertise that I have, every bit of intellectual knowledge, every bit of physical energy that I have is exhausted to resuscitate this boy who then doesn't make it. And then we have to clean the body and make it presentable, and then I was part of the team that would go out and talk to the family and tell them that I'm sorry, but your son is deceased. And then you would bring them back and let them grieve. Then we would pack the body and we would take it to the morgue. And then in any other profession, an experience like that, you would go home. You would go home to your family. There would be somebody to talk to process through that. But in emergency medicine, that's not how it is. You turn that off and you go back and you do it again. And you do it again and again and again for 13 hours a day, 40 hours a week, and so on. And over 15 years, this compounding trauma, I think, had a very significant effect on me. And that's where some people would say that well, you were burned out. And it's not. There's another thing called compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, where you begin, people who are in high stress caregiving environments, what you tend to do is you, on some level, begin to take on the pain of other people, that you actually experience mentally the trauma that other folks go through. And that's very different than burnout. And turns out that's what I had experienced, that I did not learn a healthy way to cope, and I didn't really learn how to not take this on personally. And the other thing that we know a lot are ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I was sexually abused as a 6-year-old kid, something I didn't even acknowledge in my life until about 2.5 years ago. I didn't realize the role that it played. And so all these things, they didn't cause addiction for me. They didn't cause my opioid use disorder, but what they did is they definitely made me more susceptible to developing one under the right circumstances. And for me, namely, that was depression. When depression hits, something triggers in my mind. And we talked about this cumulative stress. People who work in healthcare are at a much, much higher risk for developing mental illness and addiction. They're at much higher risk, and it's not just because they have access, but it's because of the high level of stress that we deal with, and that stress that just compounds over time, right? But one of the most dangerous things in medicine is that there's a culture of silence, that we're very stoic. We're the people, when you're in trouble, if someone falls over in here in this room on the ground, you're going to call 911. There's an expectation on those people that come through that door that they're going to know exactly what to do, right? Your complete trust is in them and their knowledge and expertise. And that is a burden that we carry as first responders. But there's also a culture that we don't talk about that. We just deal with it because we're tough, and that's what we do. And we get through it, and there's no outlet for that. And when we do struggle, there's so much stigma on top of mental illness and addiction that trying to ask for help just doesn't happen because we don't have a culture that accepts I'm sick and I need help as the caregiver. And I see this now in a totally different wave. I never thought about it until I started working in the harm reduction environment. So these are two of my friends from Philadelphia. My friend Elvis is a 25-year harm reduction worker in Philly. This man has saved more lives than, who knows how many lives this man has saved. This man trained pretty much everybody in the state how to use Narcan. I'm sure some of you know Elvis. He just retired just because it got to be too much. That he would work with people every day and try to help them every single day. And he developed these very tight personal relationships with people. And then at any given time, he would find them on the corner and would be resuscitating them. And sometimes they would come back and sometimes they wouldn't. And it got to be too much. And my friend Roz is in the same boat. This woman has reversed over 200 overdoses in the past year and a half, I think. And so I'm glad to see that we're finally starting to talk about it. But I think we need to talk about this more because given the extent since fentanyl came on the market and the severity of the opioid crisis, I don't think we're taking care of our people enough. And I think we're going to see effects down the line from this. And so one of the things that I've heard over and over again, even in treatment, when I went to treatment, when people found out that I was a nurse and the work that I did, even other patients would say, didn't you know better? Didn't you think it was a bad idea to start shooting heroin? And so what's at the root of that is stigma. Like, it's fascinating. Even within the community that struggles, there's still a level of stigma. But the big question that people get, you should have known better. And by all intents and purposes, I should have. I mean, I was in healthcare at a young age. I worked at a large academic medical center doing incredible work. I reversed overdoses all the time. I took care of people just like me. I was college educated. I had really strong social determinants. I grew up with an intact middle-class blue-collar family that loved me and cared for me. I had parents. I never suffered with food insecurity. Obviously, I don't so much now either. But all these things, and I was a product of the 80s. I mean, I was part of DARE programs. I grew up listening to Nancy Reagan and watching my favorite wrestlers say, just say no, that using drugs was a bad idea. So I should have known. Like, if you would have plotted out the trajectory of my life pre-age of 34, you would have never thought that I would have ended up homeless in Kensington doing heroin. And what drives people to say, didn't you know better, is stigma. And that's the reason why if you type in Google, if you type in drug addict, these are the type of images that you're going to see in Google, right? What you're not going to see is this picture. But at one point in my life, I could have been described in those derogatory terms as a drug addict. And so the road to recovery, and this is the other thing that I thought in medicine, that, okay, have this thing, you go to treatment, and you get better. People like to think about addiction and recovery as this very linear path, a straight line, is that, okay, you suffered with it, you go to treatment, you do the work, you get better, and you're in recovery. But it doesn't really happen that way. Recovery is very much a squiggly, long line of ups and downs. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be as twisted as it is. I think there's a lot of work that could be done to make it a much straighter path for folks. But my road to recovery was long. I had that 3.5-year period where I was on the street, homeless. Then I got into recovery for about 5 years. Then I suffered depression again. I had a relapse, and then I spent about 2 years in active use. But in those 2 years, I was desperately and actively pursuing recovery. At that point, I was remarried. I had children. But this was during the age of fentanyl again. And so overdoses were happening a lot more. And I was using a lot more often, and I couldn't figure out why. I didn't really understand. I didn't really know that fentanyl was on the market. I didn't understand the shorter half-life, but I knew that when I first started using 10 years ago, I would use 1 time a day, and I was fine. I wouldn't be sick. But with fentanyl, it was every 3 or 4 hours I was starting to feel sick again. So I was using more frequently and overdosing more frequently. My wife found me multiple times unresponsive on the bathroom at our house and had to resuscitate me with Narcan to bring me back. And over my lifetime, I was in 32 different inpatient treatment stays. And so it's a very nonlinear path. It took me a long time to find recovery. And I don't think it needed to be this way. But what was the magic sauce? This is what people ask me all the time. I was on the phone yesterday with 2 parents asking me, like, well, what worked for you? What can we do? And there's no real easy answer to that. There was no singular event or no hitting bottom episode. I mean, if you would think back when I was sitting in that abandoned house in Kensington that I grew up in as a baby, I was in the basement of that house one day, kicking over some rubble, and I found a photograph of me as a baby with my parents from the 1970s in the trash in that house. So if you were to think about a rock bottom aha moment that would have driven me into treatment, that should have been it, right? Like, I really can't think of a better thing. Or multiple overdoses, or all these things. None of the negative consequences did anything to push me further into recovery. But what I've found looking back and piecing things together is that for me, the most important thing was my family and the unconditional love of my family. When I first fell into addiction, my parents and everybody was involved, and they took a more tough love approach, which pushed me further into deeper addiction. My wife decided not to. She said, I can't do that. I love my husband, and I know him well enough to know that if I walk away from him, he'll die. And he has 3 young children. At the time, I had 1-year-old twins and a 2-year-old foster son that we were trying to adopt. And so she's like, there's just too much here. I can't walk away from him. So we made the deal that she said, as long as you keep trying, I'll stay with you. And so that's how we went through treatment after treatment. And with my wife, there was 16 of those treatments. I was in and out of treatment. And so my wife and my kids were a big part of my recovery and their continued love on me. But when I got out of treatment, I immediately had employment. And that served multiple purposes. One, I was starting to sort of feel like I was contributing to my house. And that was a crappy $9 an hour retail job. Coming from a nurse making over $100,000 a year to $9 an hour was really taxing for my family. But it also helped me develop new patterns of habit by having a place to go. And then through that, I really started to become passionate about recovery and being passionate about the recovery movement and speaking openly and honestly and publicly about my recovery to change the face, because I realized so much of what prevented me from asking for help was being so ashamed and so embarrassed, and I got really tired of feeling that way. So I came out of treatment and said, and I just made the decision that I want to be a face of recovery out there, particularly a face for healthcare professionals, and for multiple reasons. But I also had a lot of peer support when I came out of treatment, a lot of other people that I found who supported me. And so all these things sort of combined with a bunch of other things that I probably haven't even figured out yet, or the things that sort of fostered and drove my recovery. So it's just not one magic answer, as all of you know. And so what is recovery? And people, when I say I'm a person in recovery, I would imagine a lot of you think that means a certain amount of days on a calendar that I haven't injected opioids. But I don't ever speak about my recovery in terms of counting days on a calendar. One, because I think it stigmatizes us a lot by really limiting what recovery is, but it also fosters this idea of a linear process, which I don't think is really helpful. But so recovery, it's a dynamic process, and it's really defined by the individual. And so for me, it comes very much from my sense of purpose and sense of happiness in my life. And I would say the best barometer for my recovery is to come over my house when I go home tonight or tomorrow when the kids wake up and they see me. And they're very excited and hug daddy. And I get to sit on the floor playing race cars with my kid. That's recovery. It's not about that I've had 3.5 years or however long it is since I've done drugs. For me, recovery is I go home and I love my life. I'm a best dad that I can be. I think I'm a good dad, but I'm a good dad. I'm a pretty all right husband, getting better at that. But what I do every day, again, I think has value. And the work that I do every day, it is constantly at the forefront of my mind that what I'm doing today, I want to last when I'm gone so that someone else has it a little easier and that others' lives are better because of me. And that gives me purpose in my life. That gives me a sense of satisfaction. And I think that's translatable to all of you too, in the work that you do, that what you do matters. And when you go to work, it's not just a job and it's not just about sales and about the company doing well, but your job directly influences and impacts people's lives in the most dramatic way possible. What you do, the product that you make and sell, I see being used every day on the street to people who were clinically dead and they're alive and they have another opportunity to find their sense of purpose and happiness in life because of what you do. And I think that really matters. And like I said, I think it's very translatable to you. And so my life doesn't look much different than all of yours as a person in recovery. I do the things that you do. I hang out with my kids. I do lots of fun stuff, pay the bills, volunteer and serve in my community, and I do lots of fun stuff, and I enjoy my life, and that's really recovery. And on top of that, there is this period that I haven't done drugs, which I think is much less important than the other stuff. And so if you want to talk about time, so 41 out of the 46 years that I've been alive, I've been in recovery. If you're into the time thing. But anyway, part of being a nurse is I'm in a professional, health professionals monitoring program where I check in every day and do for random drug screens on my phone. I have to go to a bunch of meetings, and they track me on these meetings via GPS so that you know that I went there. And I see an addictions medicine doc, and she's really wonderful. She was instrumental in my recovery too. And so these are the things that I do in order to get my license back, and it's another 8 months until I'm up for reinstatement for my nursing license. But when I talk about recovery, I generally don't talk about me as a person in recovery. I talk about my family being in recovery because they were impacted so severely by it. but they also played such an instrumental role in me getting better. I say this often, that I'm responsible for maybe 1%. Me standing here as a living person, I'm responsible maybe 1%. My wife, Trish, is the one who should be here speaking with you because she's responsible for 99% of it. When I was in treatment 16 times throughout our marriage, she was managing 2 newborn twins, my foster son, dealing with social workers and all the things that come along with being a foster parent. She paid my insurance premiums, the co-pays. She worked full-time. She works as a social worker in the child welfare world in Philly. And she also dealt with the treatment industry that had zero contact with her when I was in treatment. And so she was completely in the dark. The only time they called her was when I wanted to leave AMA. And so she carried this enormous weight that she doesn't get enough credit for. And I think that's really sad, so I always want to give her the credit for my recovery because she should be speaking to you. And so when I talk, that's why I say my family's in recovery. But we do a lot of recovery advocacy events, and something that I really care about is healthcare professionals. And so this year, this is the Recovery Walk in Philly, and we have the biggest recovery walk out of anywhere in the country. There was 30,000 people there this year, 30,000 people who have struggled with addiction get together and publicly declare that we're in recovery from this thing that we're supposed to hide in the closet about. And I think that's amazing. But I want to see healthcare professionals in recovery saying that I'm in recovery because, again, we suffer at a higher rate than the general population. We're at higher risk, but nobody talks about it. And I think there's 2 really good reasons why healthcare professionals should publicly declare that they're in recovery. One reason is for ourselves. When I struggled 10 years ago and couldn't stop using heroin and could not figure out what was wrong with me, I didn't say a word to anybody because I was so ashamed. And I knew how we treated people in the emergency department, and I didn't want to be treated that way. And I think if we would talk more openly that there's a lot of us in recovery out there, that would make it a lot easier for our colleagues when they suffer to come forward and say, I need help, because they know they'd be treated well. And so that's one reason. The other reason is for our patients. Think about it this way. If you were diagnosed with some strange cancer or some strange illness, and you ended up in the emergency department, it takes stigma out of it. Make it an acceptable illness, some type of cancer, not addiction, but some type of illness that is not stigmatized, that's understandable. But you're in the emergency department, and the doc comes in and sits next to you who's taking care of you and says, hey, let me tell you, I actually had the exact same cancer. I know exactly what that feels like. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I have time. Think about the power that would hold for you in terms of comfort and what that would do for your mental health. And so now think about it in the current age where someone overdoses on the street and they wake up in the emergency department post-overdose and they feel like garbage, and they're in an environment where typically they're treated like crap and they're embarrassed. But now what would it be like if the nurse or the physician walked in the room and sat down and said, hey, I struggle with that too. I've overdosed 27 times and was Narcaned. I know what that feels like, but I actually got into recovery. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, think about the power that could hold. And all this could happen if we as healthcare professionals would stand up and say, struggled with that too, but I'm in recovery, and this is how it happened. And we're a large group. I think hospitals should cheer this on. I think that we should have a recovery movement within medicine, like I said, for us and for our patients. I think it's incredibly important, and that's sort of why I do what I do. And I've partnered with a number of other healthcare professionals around the state and around the country who were trying to start this movement. But I participate in a lot of other campaigns. The Independence Blue Cross, someone they plastered my picture on a bus and in front of City Hall, which interesting, in front of City Hall, I thought it was fascinating because 2.5 years ago when I got out of treatment for the last time is when I walked out and told them, I'm not being quiet. I'm not going to go sit in a church basement drinking bad coffee and only use my first name anymore. I'm going to use my full name, and I'm going to tell people exactly what happened to me, because I want everyone to know. And I was like, I would love to see a meeting in Dilworth Plaza, which is the plaza in front of City Hall in Philadelphia. I said, I would love to see a meeting at Wednesday at noon talking about recovery. And so 2.5 years later, it's not a meeting, but they stuck my silly picture there, which interestingly my wife can see from her office. And so it led to a lot of funny jokes around the dinner table. But my kids are actively involved in my recovery. These are the shirts that they wore at the recovery walk, and they had their signs that, my daddy is a nurse in recovery, and my daddy is a paramedic in recovery, and my kids know. And I talk to my kids often. And, I get a lot of questions about that. Like, how can you talk to a 4 and a 5-year-old about this? And they don't understand drugs, and they don't understand addiction. They knew that daddy was sick. The best way that I could explain it to them at the time was, Mom, daddy got bit by a snake in his head, and the doctors are fixing his head. And that's how they sort of comprehended it. But they do know what recovery is, and they know the work that I do, and they're around other people who struggle. And the reason that I do it, on top of it being a big part of my life, but I do it because I grew up in a very shame-based environment about addiction. Those people, the druggies. And that did not do me very well when I suffered with an opioid use disorder. So I want this to be a very normalized thing for my children. Not normalized in terms of drug use, but normalized in the sense that if one of them struggles, I don't want them to feel embarrassed. I want them to be able to come to me immediately. Or if their friends struggle, they can say, hey, my dad knows that stuff. Let's go talk to my dad. And that's why I talk to my kids. I spend a lot of time also with my elected officials. Most of them know who I am. And I text regularly with some of them. But I think it's really important to stay, one, in the public eye, but two, to pay attention to what's going on legislatively and have a voice in that. And so I spend a lot of time with politicians trying to make a difference on that level. And then stigma reduction is a big one for me. And so every photo that you're looking at right now, I was in active addiction. Now, what does that say about what you typically think about a drug user? Because typically what you hear is they don't care about anything except the drug. Nothing matters except that next fix. And I can say that that's not true. On the surface, it very much looks that way, but that's not what's going on. I spend time with people all the time on the street. And over this past weekend, a good friend of mine died on Saturday. He overdosed on Friday, was found down, and was on life support, was brain dead, and wound up donating his organs on Saturday. And this is a kid that I met in a recovery house 10 years ago. He was 19 at the time. He was 29 when he died. And when I found out that he was struggling again on the street, I would meet with him. And I met with him almost every day for the past 8 months on the streets in Philadelphia. And every single day when I would meet with him, at some point in the conversation, he would start crying and talking about how he just wanted to be a good dad for his kids. Because he had 3 young kids, 3, 4, and 6, that he left behind. And it just, so these images and Bobby's story really fly in the face that people don't care. Like I said, it's very easy superficially to look at people in active addiction or people like me and say, you didn't care about anything but the drug. But that's not true. Bobby struggled with a lot of emotional pain, as did I. But in the middle of me trying to fight off withdrawal, I was home for my kids. And my wife, my wife's tough. She had ground rules, like I was never alone with the kids. There were things that we did to ensure safety for the family. But I was always there as a father playing with my kids. And on here, there was one time on the far left is me with my son Micah at the urgent care because he was sick. And if you look at me, you can tell that I wasn't feeling that well either. I was in pretty active withdrawal in that photo on the left. But it was more important for me to be at the urgent care with him to get him better before I could go get better. And so I like to talk about this and be really open about my time in active use, just to try to help people understand that it's not as black and white as you think. It's not as straightforward as you think. Excuse me. And a lot of these images show that. And then the picture on the right was my last time that I went into treatment. This is what I look like. That's not a hole in my head. That was from a push pin or something like that. But this is with my kids. They were a big part of me. And this is my son, Micah. The last time I was in treatment, Micah came. He was 3 at the time. And he came up to me. We were playing basketball out back of the treatment center. And he was laughing and joking. We were playing. And he said, "Hey, Dad, you coming home today with us?" And this was my 16th time over his lifetime that I was in treatment. So it became a routine thing for me to be away. And anyway, he said, "You coming home?" And I was like, "No, buddy, the doctors still have some work that they need to do on my head." And he stopped in his tracks, grabbed my hand and looked me dead in the eye. And he said, "You know, Daddy, you make me very sad." And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And there's this expression that you hear in treatment and in recovery circles that frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. And what they mean by that is that your family can't keep you sober, that all these other things in life can't keep you sober unless you work on yourself and do what you need to do. And I found that not to be true, that my son telling me how sad he was that I wasn't a part of his life dramatically influenced me. And that didn't solve addiction for me. That didn't put me into recovery immediately. But that's something that I keep front and center in my mind when I go home at night and see how happy he is. Now that I'm home, that sustains my recovery in a way that nothing else can. Nothing else can. And so Micah was the guy that was our foster son. This is Micah's biological father, Dan, who I was really good friends with. And obviously Dan died last year. And one of the reasons, Dan died of complications from opioids. But Dan really didn't have access to a lot of the resources that I did in order to get the help that he needed. And this is Micah signing his name for the very first time. That was at his dad's funeral. And I tell this just because I need to keep this front and center. That just because I got well doesn't mean everybody got well. And the work needs to continue. But we ultimately did adopt Micah in my first year of recovery. So many wonderful things happened in my first year of recovery. The Eagles won the Super Bowl 3 months after I got into recovery. We adopted our sons. It was a pretty monumental recovery year for us. And like I said, for me, I try to do everything that I possibly can to put a face and to tell my story as someone who got into recovery and someone who overcame this, because I think that's what we need. I think we need more people in recovery speaking openly and honestly about it. And so anytime the papers call, I talk to them. Any campaign I can get a part of. The thing on the far left is part of the Independence Blue Cross, Someone You Know campaign. They have these little kiosks that rove around. And these are my kids listening to Daddy's story on the kiosk, which always, it always lends to interesting questions from 4-year-olds. But it's good stuff. And so one of the things that I do, like I said, I'm really passionate and really, really care about health professionals who struggle and health professionals in recovery, us speaking. So I partnered with another physician friend of mine, Sean Fogler, and we started a podcast where we talk about our own recovery and sort of what's going on and pitfalls and triumphs, but we interview other people who are in recovery when we can find them willing to talk. And we do this podcast, but we're now moving into a phase where we've really kind of dissected a lot about our own struggle and our own recovery and realized a lot of things that we wished we had. And one of them being peer support and high-level psychiatric support. Good counseling is what we think would have been helpful. And so we've been thinking a lot and really trying to plan over the next year that we're trying to start like a real organization where we could start an organization called Health Professionals in Recovery that we would offer peer support for other health professionals. We're thinking about a treatment, some type of peer support treatment organization that is specifically and exclusively for nurses, docs, nurse practitioners, paramedics, other health professionals in recovery where they could feel safe and come in and get support and the help that they would need. And so that's sort of our forward thinking at this point, because it's only by chance and a lot of advantage, I think, that we both ended up in recovery right now, and our lives are fruitful and we're doing really well. And I think we could do a lot better for our colleagues who are still suffering in silence. And so that's what we're kind of doing now. And so just to close, I just wanted to say thank you for everything that you do. As someone who, for the past 18 years, I've been giving Narcan to other people for 18 years. Never thought that I would be, 18 years ago, I would have never thought that this is where I would be speaking as an expert on this particular subject, as someone who has not only given but received Narcan. And the work that I do right now, full-time professionally, is I work at an outpatient treatment center in Kensington. And I don't spend a whole lot of time in the building. The majority of my time is actually out in the community, hanging out in the drug user community, either giving out Narcan or just hanging out and drinking coffee with people, talking to them. And so as a harm reductionist, like, it's a very weird trajectory of my life to have been giving it on the street, suffer myself, and now routinely reversing overdoses. And so I just wanted to say a big thank you for what you do, because I get to see every day in my face what you do, how that impacts and saves people's lives and gives them just one more shot to live a good and happy life. And so I thank you, and obviously my kids thank you. This is my daughter at the Capitol with her Narcan Saved My Daddy's Life sign. And so my kids thank you for giving them their father, and my wife thanks you. And so thank you so much for your time.